Welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insights into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time here. My name is James Brooks, and with us today for his second taped interview is Marshall Terry, Professor of English. Good afternoon, Marsh. And
hello, Jim. Good to be with you again, old friend.
And we, at the end of the last tape, we had sort of finished off approximately your first decade in Dallas and at SMU, and in a variety of roles, the latest of which was your role in the SMU administration of Willis Tate.
That's right.
So that's the point at which I think we should begin. And I've sort of chosen to style this period of time Tate's mature years. You may disagree with that, but some important things were happening very late 50s, right around 1960. Why don't you begin there and kind of talk about where things were at that time?
Well, I think that's true, and what was coming on after, let's see, I joined with the University in Administration in '57, and a few years after that, it was time, everybody thought, or Willis and Johnny Marie thought, Johnny Marie Grimes, his assistant, it was time to do a master plan. This was very important, and in retrospect was probably one of the two most important positive events that ever happened in the university. The other would be Gerald Turner's campaign, now successful campaign. But there had never been a major planning effort before, an articulation of the educational philosophy. And it seems to me that having noodled around there for a few years before this happened, that there were several reasons for undertaking it. One of them was he was about halfway through what would be his administration. And I don't think he was running out of gas, but he was, everything was responding to problems. And we'd had a lot of problems and a significant, as we said last time, a significant effort at establishing free inquiry and academic freedom in the university. University under Lee and Tate was now more a university than it had been a college. There were dimensions. One of the dimensions was research and graduate study. What to do about that? So another reason was that there was pressure, and I think one of the sources for this is a book by Johnny Marie Grimes, or she edited it, and I did the preface to it, Views and Interviews with Willis M. Tate. And she quotes him and writes on her own that Tate thought he better face the challenge of whether or not to have big-time research and graduate studies in technology and science. The ultimate idea was not to do that for reasons that I understood then to be that the nature of the university was liberal arts, humanities, and related professional studies more than the other things, and we should have the other things, but not become, as Johnny Marie said, a Cal-Tech, not that we were in any danger of becoming a Cal-Tech. This was an impetus. The other thing was, I think, that we needed to raise money. The endowment was pitiful. We went around the halls of Perkins administration thinking, my God, if we could ever have $50 million endowment, what an incredible thing that would be. We were so dependent on sustentation, annual giving. And the idea, which was clear even then, because it was not too subtly done, was to do a wonderful plan establishing SMU's bona fides as a private university and its dedication to excellence, and something else, that a church-related university could be an excellent university. and then to appeal for a grant from the Ford Foundation to help effect this. And if you look at the structure of the master plan that was set up, you'll see the name Oliver Carmichael, who was consultant to the Ford Foundation, and there he is as a consultant to this plan. Unfortunately, this didn't work out for various reasons. That is, we never got a Ford Foundation major grant. And it had to do with the religious nature of, or just in the name of SMU, I think. But that was too bad. But I think these were the impetus for doing a master plan.
Well, my recollections of the master plan, this was not something that was hatched on the second floor of Perkins Administration Building. It may have been begun there, but it was a much larger plan involving a lot more people, with several different sets of committees and external reviews and so on. You've mentioned Carmichael. There were, as I recall, were there not two other visitors of that category, one of whom was the president of Vanderbilt University?
Yes, the other two were Harvey Branscombe, who they say had been fired in his pajamas by selectmen when he was here, and but he was very dedicated to SMU doing well. And the other one was Thomas McConnell, who was at Berkeley in higher education. So this is a very serious effort, and you're right, it was really, looking back, an incredible thing for Willis to have set up. It was inclusive. There was a committee of 50 with the Dallas power structure prominent in it, 50 different people from all over the country, educators. Besides the Dallas power structure, liberal spirits like Levi Olin and Stanley Marcus, and Dick Rubottom was in on this.
When he was still in the State Department.
Yes, that's right. And it was quite an impressive lineup. Besides the committee of 50, there was a faculty committee of 5 or 6 distinguished, or yet going to be distinguished. I believe you remember that committee.
I'm not going to touch that.
Chaired by Albert Outler, but including Larry Perrine and Bill Tittle. Who else was
Charlie Galvin. A.Q. Sarton.
They both became deans.
That's right. That's right. So that was that in itself for me was a real learning experience because of the committee, but notably because of Outler and the approach and insight he brought to anything he was involved in.
Just to go on with the structure of this thing for a minute, there was a student committee and they paid attention to them. And John Hill and Hugh Hart, David Bray, still loyal alums, were on that committee with Milla Cozart and others who have remained loyal to SMU. And they really contributed to the idea of cherishing every individual student. And then I counted just before I came over here because I had forgotten, but there were 3 visiting committees, visiting in the area of journalism, what to do with journalism, the arts. And one significant thing that the master plan did, of course, was to create a school of the arts where there had just been a music school, small music school, and to put journalism in there. Journalism, the arts, and engineering.
Yeah.
The idea was, should we get rid of engineering, not to become Caltech. But there was a study of every school. There were then, besides the 3 visiting committees, 9 task forces. So this was rather an incredible, and it was a whole year's enterprise.
That's right. It began in the summer and ended the following June, I guess.
Now, I was associate coordinator of it, and I was kind of an assistant to Willis and public relations director and English instructor at the time. Johnny Marie Grimes, his assistant, that magnificent person, was an associate coordinator. And the coordinator was a guy they brought in named Jesse Hobson.
Yes.
You remember Jesse?
Oh, I remember Jesse very well. He came in from industry, as I recall.
He did, and he'd been, well, he may have come from Stanford Research Center.
I think that's right. He had been in industry with United Fruit Company and a variety of other people like that.
Yes, because one of his schemes later on was to have a campus in Honduras and send the Deadwood and the faculty there to.
Yes, I was recalling that.
But he was a serious person. He told me one time that he'd been tested when he was an adult after he'd been dean of engineering at Illinois Tech, and they said he had no aptitude for mathematics. He should be a salesman. And this is what he was. But he was supposed to steer this. He had Ford Foundation connections, and he was supposed to steer this so that they would love it. And he was a very creative person, and he was a fireball.
He was, and he then became vice president of the university for a number of years, having to do with research and that sort of thing.
Yeah. What the master plan did was to articulate the philosophy of the university, to review all the schools, create one new school, to in the academic philosophy to determine that the liberal arts was the basis, and that our students needed the perspective of general education, leading on to those courses that our alumni will remember and cherish: the nature of man, discourse and literature, the humanities course, yeah. Or as Provost Ayers said at one point, the history of practically everything. But these marvelous interdisciplinary courses that were set up under the aegis of the university college, which is kind of a tent that they put them in.
And that was another structure that was created by the master plan, was the university college.
Right.
As you said, it was a tent, unlike any of the other what Joe Quillian would call sure enough schools that had faculties and so on. The university college was really just a structure to bring everybody in the university theoretically together in the name of liberal arts.
And that was its strength, also its Achilles heel.
That's right.
Because after a number of years, you ran out of people who were willing to hazard their tenure or turn from their specialization to teach in this. I grew up as a teacher teaching those courses, and it was a wonderful education. And that structure has remained with us till now. And the philosophy, I'd like to say something about the philosophy. This is one of the few now extant copies of the original master plan.
Yeah.
You can see it has Dallas Hall on it.
That is almost a collector's item now.
Yes, it really is. And the introduction of it says this, and this sentence is now on the wall of the new bookstore, SMU bookstore. The essence of the educational philosophy which undergirds this master plan is that professional studies must rise from the solid foundation of a basic liberal education. And that was it in a nutshell, and we have not deviated from that. The aim of this university is to educate its students as worthy human beings and as citizens first, and as teachers, lawyers, ministers, research scientists, businessmen, engineers, and so on, second. These two aims, basic and professional education, general and special, will not be separated in the program of this university. It's this university's belief that they should not be, for the well-educated person is indeed a whole human being, His intelligence and his practical interests interact in all of his major activities. The courses and teaching processes of Southern Methodist University will be so designed that these general and special aims are carried out concurrently and in relation to each other. In this way, it's SMU's aim that every graduate be truly a well-educated person. This was 1962, 63.
Mm-hmm.
This was going in the face of a lot of things that were going on in higher education.
Nationally, that's certainly true. There's another thing in addition to that very important philosophy, which I think of all the important things that came out of the master plan, perhaps the statement and restatement of that philosophy, which Willis adopted as his own, was one of the most important things that did come out of that. And it is, as you pointed out, has served the university well for almost 40 years now.
Well, sometimes I feel a little bit like Thomas Jefferson. I wrote that. I remember sitting at the typewriter saying, how shall I phrase this? It was a philosophy. It wasn't my philosophy. It was what had come from a study here with a bunch of very serious people creating a university philosophically.
Yes.
And that was very exciting. But it's true that Paul Hardin reaffirmed this, and Jim Zumberg reaffirmed this. I don't think Ken Shields particularly did.
You mean Ken Pye?
Yes, I do. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of my colleague and brother Ken Shields, who was a cousin of Don Shields. Donald Shields was not quite there philosophically, but Kenneth Pye was, and then these same sentences sit right at the heart of the Turner strategic plan.
Absolutely.
So I think that's I think that's good, and the structure of the general education has been changed and fixed and reoriented several times, but it's still there too.
Yeah, wrapped slightly differently than it was in 1963 and 64, but nonetheless functioning, which is the important dimension of it. There's another thing that came along at about the same time, and I do not remember whether it came out of the master plan directly or simply followed hard on its heels, and that was the reorganization of the Board of Trustees and the creation of a Board of Governors.
Well, if I may, and I will anyway, there were some things that could be called negatives that came out of the master plan. I think that each president, as Willis Tate said, was right for his time, each SMU president. And I think that philosophically, I certainly had bought into that idea that we would not be weighted overly on the technological, scientific side. It appeared to be a terrible mistake later, as Dallas exploded as a technological, scientific center. And the university was not adequate to that challenge. And now there's great effort going on in engineering and in other areas of the sciences, and there have been a lot of PhD programs added. And Gerald Turner really sees that it's our destiny to be in Dallas and that we need these things. So maybe that wasn't the right decision, but I don't know what else he would have done with deficit budgets, not much endowment.
That's right, and without a clear and obvious benefactor saying that there would be massive support for this.
The other thing that happened was the Board of Governors was created. And wasn't that just about 18 people or something like that?
Yeah, my recollection is it was never more than 20 and seemed to be never fewer than about 15.
And these were people who were and were not trustees.
That's correct. Some were trustees, and some, this was frankly, I think, a method of bringing in people that the university wished to have in its board structure, but for whom there was not room on the Board of Trustees. The Board of Governors, as it operated, met monthly, whereas the trustees met only 2 or 3 times a year. And the trustees were what, 85?
85, yes.
Yeah, something like that. So this was a far more mobile board.
Unwieldy, but a wonderful rubber stamp.
That's right, and that was the role that it came to have, unfortunately. And as we both know, to our regret and the regret of almost everyone, that played in much later to some of the problems that the university had with the athletic program in the mid-'80s.
I think it did, because the governors were running things, and I remember at one point there was AAUP was going to be an investigation of direct control of the university by trustees. And the theory that goes along with this, and I adhere to it, is that the whole football scandal, that racking event in our history, was at base, and very base, a structural institutional governance problem. The too few people had power.
Yeah, that's right. And there was an interlocking leadership where the more powerful of the 2 board chairmen, as I viewed it in my experience, was the chairman of the Board of Governors, but the chairman of the Board of Trustees was closely involved too, and always both of them were on both boards. That was one given. And you said it exactly correctly as I viewed it, and that was too much power was vested in far too few people. And that led to the problems that caused the university a great deal of travail in the mid-'80s.
I think it really did. Can I backtrack to the master plan a minute?
Yes, let's go back.
You were on that faculty committee of the master plan.
Yes.
And they produced you produced, but I think it's mostly written by Albert Outler.
It was with...
And I wonder if you would say something about that experience. Albert Outler had been the Timothy Dwight professor at Yale, and he came here and he was a scholar of John Wesley and Methodism. My God, he was a charismatic person, and I think he had great influence in this master plan.
Yes, he did, and I mentioned a moment earlier that was one of the real educations of my life, was to work with Albert in that year of the master plan. Al was brought in along with some other very distinguished people to the Perkins theology faculty by Merriman Cunningham when he was building Perkins to its present stature. And
Perkins was the place where the scholarship was going on in the humanities.
That's exactly right, because you had John Deschner and Schubert Ogden and Vic Furnish and people like that, some of whom are still with us, many of whom have gone on. But Al, even though he was the most distinguished of the faculty planning committee by far in terms of his recognition and accomplishments, he treated everybody with great equality, and he had the ability, he's the only person I've ever known who had such a wide range of knowledge and interest, and I've never been quite sure whether he was an extremely skilled dilettante or whether he really was a Renaissance man, and I'm quite inclined to think the latter, because as a geologist, he would read something in the newspaper, and the next meeting of the faculty plan committee, he would interrogate me for 10 or 15 minutes about whatever it was that had caught his interest. And that's the way he was with everybody on that committee. And you know, he had the mastery of language, and he made sure that all of us were involved in and it's really signed off on all of the principles that were enunciated in that faculty planning committee document, but the words were his.
And he could enunciate them so beautifully. He would say the name of that, the rather pretentious name of that essay was The Idea of the University and the Idea of SMU as a University.
That is right, that's right.
And it must come to be excellent, but then it must be supported. And if on the one hand there could be a great university that was church-related, it would be a Methodist university because of the Wesleyan tradition of think and let think. On the other hand, if it was going to emerge, it must be supported by the church. And I think these were the basic ideas.
And truth and vital piety also was a part of the general package of terms that came into those writings and talkings at that period of time.
Let us unite those two so long
divided.
Truth and
vital piety. That's right.
And he also said that veritas liberabit vos is no idle motto.
That's right.
We mean it.
That's right.
So it's a remarkable document. It still holds up.
Well, that was a very interesting group of people from across the university. Engineering, Bill Tittle at that point was in engineering. Sarton had been in psychology, was in business at the time. Galvin was in law, I was in science. Perrine was in one of the real bastions of faculty strength in English, and we brought very little in common except a desire to make the university better and to shape it, have an opportunity to shape it was a real privilege for us, and we took it quite seriously. Met at least once a week, often at length, no small part of which was Albert's wordsmithing, which was a delight.
He was a writer and a speaker. Remember that he was a stated observer at Vatican II?
Yes.
In the story about the Pope would come in and look over the audience and say, "Is Al here?"
Yeah, that's right. And you just were never quite sure but what that might not have actually happened. But that came in near the end of the master plan, but those of us who'd worked with him, he took great joy and enthusiastically shared all of both the real philosophical substance of the deliberations of Vatican II, as well as a lot of church gossip that Albert reveled in.
I think it was his term at University College and his idea.
Yeah, I think it was.
That general education.
I think it was.
Strongly for that. He never did teach in the general education program.
No, he was diverted. I think he might have, but he was diverted by Vatican II, which came along right at that time.
Certainly, John Deschner and many others in Perkins School of Theology taught in the the humanities program.
John played a very vital role. He was, as I recall, he was on the first University College Council, which was the faculty council that was, I guess, mandated in the master plan or derived from it, that had representatives from all of the faculties of the university. I think there were one from each of the schools and three from the School of Humanities and Sciences, as I recall.
John Deschner was an important figure in this university. He came to be the conscience of the university.
Yes, he did.
Academically.
And later on, when I was provost, there were a handful of people, one of whom was you, but people that when things were really tough and we needed an anchor, Deschner was certainly one of a very small number of people that I called on regularly because he did have that university perspective, as did Schubert Ogden. And they were very, very helpful, for 20, 25, 30 years afterwards, after the master plan itself.
Yeah.
So the master plan really was an instrument that had tremendous impact on the university and is still having impact. You alluded in a comment a minute ago to the fact that Dallas has become a technological community. Coming along about the same time, shortly afterwards, was the Southwest Center for Advanced Studies Graduate Research Center of the Southwest, and that whole set of names that all applied to the same organization. You were still in university administration at that time, I think.
Yes, I was. Lloyd Berkner came down to be the director of that.
That's right.
The prophet of Sleepy Eye, Minnesota.
Lloyd was an interesting phenomenon, a geophysicist who had been on the first bird expedition to the Antarctic, and very prominent and very active member of the National Academy of Science. And he had been recruited by Eric Johnson, Cecil Green, and Eugene McDermott to come and head the Graduate Research Center Incorporated, as it was initially called. And
yes, I remember the story in the Atlantic, I think, Atlantic Monthly.
That's right. I think that's where it was.
Of Berkner coming into this vast wilderness.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Intellectual desert.
Yes, right. That organization, of course, became the University of Texas at Dallas.
That's right.
All the way along, that it was going to be just a research institution, then it was going to be just graduate work and PhD studies, and then it was just going to be the last 2 years, and it was never going to have an engineering school, and so on. So in a way, it was kind of our Frankenstein monster thing.
It really was, and Claude Albritton, who was graduate dean at the time, had great hopes initially that there would be an ongoing linkage between the Graduate Research Center and SMU that would help us grow graduate programs in science and engineering. And for a variety of reasons, that never came to pass, and they moved north to Plano and North Richardson. But they had a profound effect because Berkner's concept was that they would provide a first-class faculty. They would not grant degrees, but their faculty would be available to work with the faculties of universities in the area, of which SMU was, by geographic proximity and history, to be the largest beneficiary. And gradually, as the burdens of supporting an institution like that increased, the founders felt that it was important to try to incorporate it in the University of Texas system, and it became UTD then.
Yeah.
So, but now in this same time, Marsh, actually before the master plan began, you have alluded early on to the development of advanced graduate programs, PhD programs, and you were in administration at least when some of those commenced. The first one was in economics.
Yeah, I believe in 1958 or 9. Yeah, does that strike you as a strange choice?
It did, and it does. But that perhaps is provincial on my part.
Well, of all of the graduate programs that might be controversial, in this part of the country, economics would probably lead the list.
But it represented, I believe, just institutions are built so often by strong personalities, and economics was headed by another one, Dick Johnson.
Yes, I was going to say, you can understand it in terms of Dick Johnson. We mentioned last time Dick Johnson, and when I was working with Sam Bloom, I worked with Dick Johnson in the Graduate School of Banking, Swigsby. And he was a dynamic guy, and he pulled me back into SMU, as I said last time. And of course, the force of his personality was all over that decision. But they recruited some interesting people from outside.
Interesting and strong people. Paul Homan, who had retired in those days, a mandatory retirement age of 65 at UCLA, which was one of the strong departments nationally, strong departments of economics. And Paul Homan was perfectly capable of continuing on for several years beyond his mandated retirement, and came and really built the initial PhD faculty.
Yes.
There with, of course, Dick's and Claude's help, Claude Albritton. Now, along about this time, Marsh, you moved out of administration into teaching.
Well, my personal dynamic was back at the time of the master plan. I had been since 1958 part of the administration with Willis and Sterling Wheeler and Johnny Marie Grimes. And at that time I was, I think, 30 or 31 years old. I just published a novel. So this master plan was a great bunch of fun for me. We were all trying our philosophical wings. Then after the master plan,
well, your first novel, let me be sure we mention that, was Old Liberty.
Old Liberty, which was a college novel about Liberty College. Old Liberty was a dormitory which burned down, unfortunately, in the book. And the protagonist was a kid named Redwine Walker from Texas. So it was my romantic response to being in Texas. So it was time for me to write another novel. And so in 1965, I crossed back over to full-time teaching and out of administration. I wasn't tired of doing public relations. I wasn't tired of working with Willis, and we kept a strong relationship. And I participated in things always after that still. But it was time for me to write again, to do my own writing for a while. And that's what happened. And Larry Perrine, who had been my teacher, engineered this deal whereby I could come back again as an instructor in English with the proviso that if I published a nationally recognized novel and did something like Lon Tinkle, who didn't have a PhD, did, like being book critic of the Dallas Morning News, that then I could be considered for promotion to assistant professor and maybe ultimately tenured as an assistant professor, but never a higher rank than that. I said, okay. Seemed like a pretty good deal to me. And so I published a novel called Tom Northway that was nationally reviewed, and later joined Lon Tinkle as co-book critic of the Dallas News. And 7 years after I went back as instructor, I was a full professor chairing the department. So it worked out okay.
Well, let's just say that the move gave people an opportunity to realize that you had talents beyond those that they recognized when they made the first proposition to you.
Well, I appreciate that, Jim, but you know, the old guard in English, John Boyer particularly, Said, don't let him come back in. He'll teach creative writing.
Yeah, you had some senior colleagues in those days that were quite staunch in their feelings and their beliefs. Well, moving on a little bit. Well, let me just ask you to comment a little bit more on the English department. You had experienced it as a student and then as a lecturer, instructor, and now you're coming. Then you were in administration. Now you're coming back in the mid-'60s to a department that is the same but yet has changed.
Exactly. It was a very traditional department. And I think I said before, they would gather in the morning and good morning, Dr. Beatty. Good morning, Dr. Boyer. Good morning, Dr. Bond. Good morning, Dr. Lisey. Hello, Ima. Ima Heron being the one woman there with her PhD who was going to be a full professor and was going to chair the department. And when I did my master's thesis at SMU on elements of Stoicism in the works of Ernest Hemingway, George Bond worked with me. And it was a very brave thing for him to do because John Boyer thought that Hemingway was not of the stature that anybody should write a thesis about him in 1954 when he got the Nobel Prize. So there were those ironies. When I went back into the department, they were just wonderful to me. And I remember I moved into an office that had 2 desks and a window. And John Lee Brooks and George Bond shared this office, and they put in a 3rd desk for me, which I thought was very gracious. And I was really accepted, and the department had changed and loosened up. They had hired one Pascal Covici Jr., the son of the great editor Pat Covici, thinking he was Italian, not for a moment dreaming that he was Jewish. His father was a rabbi in Romania. Pascal was a great, outspoken, sometimes outrageous spirit. And he had studied with Perry Miller at Harvard, and he was going west, literally going west, like he used to do, like I had done. Yeah. And Larry Perrine was coming into his own. I remember his saying, "Oh my goodness, I have to finish this book or I won't be promoted." And he had been promoted to associate professor. And the book was, of course, was Sound and Sense, which made him nationally famous, made the whole department nationally famous. So, and there were younger people in the department. Yeah. And there were women in the department, and it had changed quite a bit, and it was a wonderful place to be.
Yeah, it was one of the kind of intellectual anchor departments of the university. It always seemed to me that that was where one of the places at least where a certain set of values about liberal education were really practiced and cherished.
I think that's, and you mentioned Larry Perrine. He was so signal. He was a chief proponent, and he had this massive integrity.
Yes, Larry was always very interesting to me. He was almost contemptuous of science, just as a general proposition, and yet some of Larry's analysis of poetry was very scientific in the way he went about analyzing it, and I always thought that was very interesting. He had one other great passion, which was baseball. And he really kept up with baseball and baseball players and teams, and that was one of the other things that I learned about him during the master plan years, because he would share his interests as we all did.
Well, you know, he gave me a present once, which was his baseball glove.
Is that right? That's interesting.
Which was a wonderful present. And if you look around, you'll see that creative writers and poets and English professors, they all love softball and baseball. And we had a hell of a softball team. We had a terrific softball team. That was some of the most fun. I pitched, and Pascal and Jim Early were tremendous hitters, and Larry'd skip around.
Well, that was quite a group. Along about that same time, maybe a little bit earlier, I was playing handball with Harold Jeske in chemistry quite frequently, and very often we would play Pascal and Larry in handball, and that was certainly an unlikely quartet. Moving on a little bit, towards the end of the 60s, you were kind of summoned back to duty when the matter of the Southern Association reevaluation that came up every 10 years was due, and I think Neil McFarland was then provost, and we launched a self-study.
Yes.
And you were, as Paul Harton later referred to you, you were the scrivener, among other things.
Lon Tinkle had called me the amanuensis.
Probably a better term.
For the master plan, but yes, Paul called me the scrivener. And that was quite a piece of work.
It was.
It was very demanding. I worked with Bill Stallcup.
Bill was the general chairman of the self-study committee, as I recall.
And we worked through the hot summer. And it gave a chance for continuity from the master plan to that event and effort, because the first two chapters of this self-study were the history of the university and the philosophy of the university. So it gave me a chance to write and refresh and restate, but state again, going back to the master plan, that particular philosophy that I talked about before, and to make sure that it was ongoing, and then it became part of our institutional being to the accrediting agencies. I think it was an important effort.
I think it was too, and it's important to say that along about that time, we're now late 60s, that was what, 67, 68, along in there, Marsh?
1968, yes.
Yeah. I think it's important to say that campuses everywhere were really beginning to be in turmoil because of the Vietnam War and the Johnson international policies and so on, President Johnson.
2 assassinations in 68 after the war.
That's right.
60.
So there was a great deal of travail, and that led, I think, to the creation of some structures that are associated in my mind correctly or otherwise with the self-study, because the governance business kind of came along as a piece of the self-study following on.
Well, this was an interesting facet of Willis. Remember back at the time of the assassination, I wanted to be dramatic, and I wrote something quoting John F. Kennedy, and Willis told me to go down the hall of my office and stay there. and he did a very sober job of saying, is there anything wrong with Dallas? Let's begin an Institute of Urban Studies, and a very positive thing. And so it was in that turbulent time. And he believed that students were reasonable and should have their voice. And he'd steadily given them their voice, and that's the way he handled what went on in our campus. And it was very positive. And there did emerge a rather complicated governance system in which everybody, administration, staff, faculty, and students were represented. And this thing drained the just drained the gumption out of protests, because you had a place to go to.
Yeah, that's true, and it drained it at two times. One, when it was all being talked about and planned, and then in the implementation with, as you say, all of these various boards and councils and so on that grew out of the plan. Enough people were involved that they had a way of expressing themselves that was non-destructive for the most part, which many universities did not have.
Were you deaning at that time?
I was deaning in the latter part of that. I was involved with the governance committee and worked with our much admired Johnny Murray Grimes, who really ramrodded that, and with the faculty and student committee. And we came up with this, what is, I think, for the long haul, far too complicated a structure. But nonetheless, it came out of that, and it did a lot of good. And there was some large body that was kind of a pan-university body that had faculty and students, and I cannot remember the name of it, whether it was a university council or what, but it had administration, students, and faculty all on it, and I think maybe even a couple of alums.
I think that's true. I forget the name of it myself.
But
and I never did serve on that, but I observed it, and I think Ruth Morgan.
Ruth was the first chair of it. And, I think in hindsight, one of the most important things to come out of the whole governance thing of that period was the establishment of a well thought through and well functioning judiciary, which we had before, but not in as mature a form as it now exists. And that judiciary, to my knowledge, is still with us and functioning.
That's an important point, and if you look at all of this through another lens, which is student participation,
yeah,
you could see that that came beginning in the master plan. That came steadily along, and it is true that our students still have access to trustees, serve on the trustees.
That's right.
Manipulate terrific big budgets.
That's right.
Learn all these skills, are represented not only in Student Senate but many other ways, and this steadily progressed. And there is a judiciary that handles these handles cases quite well. So this is a kind of a mini universe of reality for students.
That's right.
And it's part of their education.
Part of their education that is, I think, you look at judiciaries at universities around the country, and they function in varying degrees of effectiveness and even-handedness. And I've always been impressed with how well the one here seems to work, and it grew out of that period of time. Let's before we run out of time, Marsh, let's talk a little bit, because coming along 1971 in that period, there were beginnings of conversation about a successor to Willis, and you were involved in that process too.
Well, I was. I don't know who initiated that, do you?
I don't know.
Or was it just inevitable? Willis?
I always had the impression that Willis was tired and felt like he had done what he could do.
He'd been president since 1954.
That's right.
And so a new president was named in 1972. That's a long, that's an unusually long
18 years
tenure. At any rate, when it got underway, I was an elected member of the search committee, elected by the faculty senate to be the faculty representative. And there was a student representative, Joanne Means. And I'll never forget flying into Spartanburg, South Carolina, to Wofford College with Bill Clements and Joanne.
Bill being the chairman of the committee.
In his private plane, to interview one Paul Hardin, who came sashaying up to the plane in his black leather jacket, and Bill Clements liked that a lot. And we had a very nice dinner and a discussion of everything, including athletics.
Mm-hmm.
I remember Paul Hardin voiced some skepticism about big-time athletics ever being successful, and Bill Clements said, "Well, we do that." That was about the end of that discussion. But Paul, I think, was an excellent choice for president, and he was, I think, Jim, he was 40 years old.
He was 39.
39?
Yes.
Okay. Point taken, though. I mean, you know.
Exactly. Your point is.
And here he came under the wing of the great old eagle. And I think Willis did his best to stay out of out of the way. He was chancellor. There had been a chancellor before, which had been Humphrey Lee.
That's right.
After Willis had been named. So Willis could understand that, I'm sure. And I don't think he intruded. And then Paul named a provost, I believe.
He did. He named me provost. And
that was a damn good thing he did.
Well, I appreciate your saying so. And I hate to interrupt because we could talk a lot about the Paul Hardin episode, but we're coming to the end of this segment of taping, Marsh, and I have enjoyed both of them, and appreciate your taking time to pull together your memories, because you have spanned an awfully important period in the life of the university, and these are important contributions to the archives of the university, and I appreciate you taking time and making the effort to share them.
My pleasure, Jim. It's been my pleasure all the way along.